station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome back to Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and I'm talking for the last time today about Havana. The episodes in this series, there's been 10 total. This is the 10th. I was tasked with creating 20 objects in order to describe the history of Cuba's most important cities and one with an enormous influence in the Caribbean. And I've finally made it to my last two items. Now, I've certainly had difficulty struggling through the revolution and finding objects that work for this sort of enormous period of change that happens in a relatively small period of time relative to the history of Havana. So last week I talked about the coffee and urban farming, a couple innovations and challenges faced by the revolution. And now I have to take the revolution to the present day through the modernization or changes after the fall of the Soviet Union and to the current state of Havana. So my final two objects are one that habaneros might not like so much and one that might leave you scratching your head. The first is the Camel, a giant trailer bus that was pulled by a truck. An 18-wheeler invention. We'll talk more about it in a second. That sort of symbolizes the struggle of Havana after the fall of the Soviet Union, leading up to their continued march slowly towards modernization. And the other one is the flag of Cuba, which, how can I choose a national flag to represent a city? I'll explain. So first, let's talk about what happens in Cuba. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there's what's called a special period in which Havana and Cubans have to find a new way to survive without the reliance of the Soviet Union. So they had that growth period that was extremely difficult after the United States left and rejected the revolution. And then, with an alliance with the Soviet Union, a lot of trade was created with the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet sphere. But what changed is the Soviet Union fell. And Fidel Castro, as early as March, was making speeches saying, even if they fall, it's not going to impact us. And he was right. The Cuban government survived through the economic hardship. And one of the ways they did this was innovation. I talked last week about urban farming and how that sort of attempted to fill the gaps of this lack of production. Another thing was the creation of these strange new types of technology. And one was the Camel, which is just there's a Spanish word for camel, because what Havana needed was transportation systems, and it didn't have buses because the old Soviet buses no longer had parts to repair them because there was no more Soviet Union. So the factories in the Soviet Union could no longer create the parts that could fix these Soviet buses in Cuba. Additionally, they couldn't get new buses from the United States, and they didn't have many trading partners. So one of the solutions was these giant trailer buses. You think the commute in New York City is bad on the subway? You have never been on a Camel in Havana. Those buses were pulled, just imagine a semi, a giant truck, 18-wheeler, except this one resembled a Camel because it had two humps. Where the sets of wheels were, the bus would go up and then it would go down in the center, a very long track, and then up in the back again. So it did resemble a camel, but inside it was truly a hellish landscape. So you would have highly educated people, you would have plastic surgeons, you would have doctors, you would have lawyers who needed to get from the suburbs to the city. They needed some sort of transportation. There's no subway, there's no buses, but they would get on these giant truck trailer bus imagined camels and be packed in there by the hundreds. All classes of society would ride this. It was one of the only sources of transportation, and they could fit up to 300 people. And the stories are just fascinating. You can read about people talking about the things they heard and saw. It was described as like a dirty Saturday night because you would hear the most filthy things, see the most dirty things. The smell was horrifying because a giant diesel truck was in front pulling this huge trailer that just, it was loud, it was smelly, it was hot. It's always hot. It was wet. People are sweating. It was just symbolic of the struggle and sort of the persistence that was necessary for the people to survive this special period. And indeed, many left Havana if they got the chance. In 1994, there was the massive exodus, 30,000 leave trying to get to the U.S., the balseros on rafts, on created rafts. So people would build rafts in their homes in Havana. You know, one day you'd see someone bringing old tires into their home, and the next day you'd see them with the community taking this man-made raft out to the sea, out to the shore in Havana, and if it sunk, they would start building again in an attempt of getting out of this just absolutely decimated economy. Now, the other item I've chosen is the national flag. And you might be saying, how can you choose the national flag as the final item of representation for a city history? Well, both because of the importance of Havana in terms of Cuba's story, but also because of the growth of Cubanidad, the growth of culture, the growth of Cubanness inside of Havana. So cities, I said it when I begin the series, and I'm going to continue this theme as I begin to do other cities around the world. Cities are enormously important centers of culture, of culture exchange, acculturation, things like this, growth, and Cubanidad, the sense of being Cuban, Cubanness, just throughout the centuries grows with a focal point in Havana. So just to look at the flag, it's sort of and my students and my colleagues know that I love looking at flags as representations of nations and cities and places. If you look at the Cuban flag, there's so much story to it, right? It's one of only a couple flags of communist nations that does not have any communist imagery. You're not going to find a hammer and sickle on the Cuban flag. In fact, it dates back to founding in a different city. It was founded, this flag was created, the Lone Star banner, the Estrella Solitaria, was created in New York City, actually, by a Venezuelan general and a Cuban poet. And the symbolism behind it is pretty representative of this sort of Cubanness. So the colors red, white, and blue. The red triangle is and this is according to Fidel's official definition as well as the sort of documents we have about the people who designed the flag back in 1849. The red triangle is a symbol of the French Revolution and the ideals of the French Revolution that the Cubans wanted to bring to Cuba. So liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. These three things that were born of the French Revolution, sort of the People's Revolution, hundreds of years before the Cubans actually get their independence, were central to the idea of what it meant to be Cuban. And these themes are certainly noticeable both in pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary Havana. The star was a symbol, this lone star at the time was a symbol of the idea that Cuba might once in the future be a part of the United States. And so the star was sort of this, imagine one day it will represent the star on the American flag. The three bars represent the three divisions of Cuba. It was in three different districts. And then the colors white and blue also, there's been various definitions for these, but white is sort of like this purity of ideals, and blue is just there. I haven't been able to find a good explanation for the blue. Now, the definitions change, of course, over time, and interpretations change, but you'll see that flag flying throughout Havana because Havana is central to what it means to be Cuban, and the world tends to think of Havana, even though it hasn't grown enormously, still only 2 million people, and in a lot of ways it's stuck in the past. People associate Havana with Cuba. Now, as far as relationship between Havana and the rest of the world, it's out of the special period and it's opened up again to the world. It's become a major tourist destination for most of the world. In March of 2016, President Obama became the first U.S. president to visit Cuba since 1928. He went to Havana, and in August of that year, the first commercial flights began again between the United States and Cuba. United Airlines now flies direct from Newark to Havana, and that's the first time since 1962. Fidel Castro also dies in Havana at age 90 in 2016. His brother Raul Castro was already in charge of Cuba. In 2017 as well, the U.S. embassy is open again, and the U.S. is once again establishes relationship with Cuba. So right on the Malecon, the U.S. embassy and a new era of sort of cooperation begins to exist. Now, there were a series of attacks in 2017, sonic attacks, that have yet to really be explained against 24 employees in the U.S. embassy, which resulted in the U.S. expelling 15 Cuban diplomats from the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., but it did not close the embassy. So the United States still has relations with Cuba, and those relations are still going on in Havana with the minimum amount of personnel required, which is more of a theme for U.S. politics than it is for Cuban politics. So in bringing this series to an end, I presented 20 items that I thought were representative of the Cuban Havana story. Now, Havana seems to have a special place in the minds of historians, in music, in literature, whether it is the Paris of the West or the Las Vegas of the West, whether it is Havana itself, or just a name. It continues to retain that sort of magic that it has had for the Spanish dating back to the 1500s, through various regimes, through U.S. influence, through British intervention, through military dictatorships, through communist revolutions. The people of Havana have found ways to continue, whether it's baseball, whether it's integration, diversity, whether it's music, attracting the world culturally to this unique city in the middle of the Caribbean. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I want to thank you for listening to this series. If you have any questions about Havana, if you have any questions about Cuba, if you're going to travel to Havana and you need some assistance in planning, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for joining this Hour of History Cities program. Coming up soon is Hour of History Cities, looking at the cities of the World Cup. So thanks again. Remember, on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.